Hello, and welcome to this lecture on the background to the comic scare. Now, kind of the ultimate year of the comic book scare, you could say, is 1954. That's when there will be the Senate hearings, which will involve comic books, and that will basically frighten the industry so much that it will adopt a policy of self-censorship, the Comics Code Authority. But you can actually go back further to actually even before World War II to find people starting to critique, starting to be afraid of comics and their influence, especially among young people. We're going to start in the middle of World War II. And you can see during that time period, there will be people who will say, are comics fascist? Right? They'll say, are comics fascist? There actually was a Time magazine article, are comics fascist? And the problem is, fascism is a word that's used today often as like an insult, right? If someone is on the political right, someone else might call them a fascist. And the problem is, even though fascism is on the political right, all people on the political right are not fascists, and it creates confusion, and it won't be clear what people mean when they're talking about fascism in the 40s and even into the 50s because they use the word differently. So fascism, in a nutshell, I mean, the quickest way to think of it is when you think of Adolf Hitler. The Nazis were fascists. I have an Italian poster here because actually Benito Mussolini is the one that pioneered fascism. But when you think fascism, you're pretty safe thinking about Nazis. But in fascism, you have a mass party centered around a dynamic, charismatic leader, right? That's kind of the center, is the leader, the one who's going to kind of solve all of our problems. And again, that person, in order to convince us he's going to solve all our problems, has to be dynamic, has to be charismatic. The goal then is to use that mass party to seize control of the state and establish a party state. What do I mean by that? A state in which there is essentially only one political party in charge. And other political parties are not even allowed typically to exist. Right? So imagine if the Republican Party was able to take power, or the Democratic Party were able to take power and dissolve the other party and then hold power in perpetuity. That's what you would have. The fascism tends to emphasize nationalism, the idea that you need this leader and his party. I say his because it's always the leaders of fascist movements, to my knowledge, were always men. And his party, they're going to take over the state for the good of the nation. Right? So there's this emphasis on nationalism. And because of this, there's a strong anti-communism, because communism tends, theoretically at least, to emphasize class and the kind of universal fraternity, or the brotherhood and sisterhood of workers. Workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. That's kind of the communist slogan. And so it's saying that your most important thing is to work together with other workers, even if they're from another country. From a fascist perspective, that's crazy. You need to be working for the good of the nation. And the idea then is you need an authoritarian and totalitarian state. Authoritarian means the state gets to tell you what to do. Right? It's a one-way kind of dialogue. The state tells you what to do, you do it. And totalitarian, it means in all aspects of life. Right? So the state can tell you what to do pretty much in your entire life. And the state will exercise total control then to bring social unity and solve the problems that the government faces, or that the nation faces. That's kind of the basic idea. In addition, there is also an emphasis on the militarization of society, and this often leads to a celebration of violence. You can kind of see there, that's one of the big things that made people nervous about comics, right? Because they tended to emphasize power and strength. And you can kind of see that in this Italian poster here, right? I mean, this is kind of an interesting political poster, right? It's a guy with a gun with massive biceps. So to go into a little bit more ideology of fascism, particularly of the Nazi variety, and that's what people typically have in mind and had in mind when they talked about fascism, it helps to look at Adolf Hitler, and particularly ideas that he had in his book Mein Kampf, which literally means my struggle. And so it's no surprising that someone who would call a book My Struggle would be interested in social Darwinism. Social Darwinism basically is the idea of applying survival of the fittest to human nations or races. And for fascists, race and nation kind of go together. And it basically holds that different races are in a struggle for existence with each other, right? So there's no kind of universal humanity here. If you're a German Aryan, you're in a struggle with those Slavs. They may actually look similar to you, right? They may both be white, but it doesn't matter. You're a different race, and you're in a struggle for survival with them. And Nazis actually referred to themselves as National Socialists. Basically, they wanted the government control the economy for the good of the racial/biological nation. That was kind of the basic idea. And individual rights and freedom for them was unimportant. And part of the idea of individual rights and freedoms are an idea of the rule of law, right? As free individuals with rights were governed by laws that we helped make. Nazis hated that. They thought that it made people weak. And so when they looked at the United States, they said the Americans, for example, are weak because they emphasize individual rights and freedoms too much. And law just exists to protect the weak, but we should emphasize the strong because we're in this struggle for survival. Like I said, there's this ideas of nation and race. There's this idea that Germans are part of this pure Aryan race that makes them special. Now, it goes beyond Germany, especially to the Scandinavian countries. But basically, Germans are a kind of master race, a kind of supermen. And this was a word sometimes that Hitler really liked. He got this idea from Nietzsche, the philosopher, as, in a sense, supermen. They should rule the world. And I do want to stress, it's my understanding that Superman is connected to that Nietzschean idea of a very powerful person who will hopefully kind of remake society. So you can kind of see why some people might be concerned when they're fighting fascism that comics seem to have fascist ideals, because they tend to emphasize power and conflict and struggle. In addition, there was this kind of blaming of other races, internal enemies, such as, for example, Jewish people were seen as traitors. Germany's defeat in World War I was blamed on Jewish people. It said that they betrayed the nation. They said the German army was never actually defeated in the field, which is technically true. They weren't. The German army was in France when Germany gave up, surrendered during World War I. And veterans like Adolf Hitler said, well, we won the war. It was just that basically the Jews back home betrayed us and surrendered the country. And Jewish people and other people who were considered unfit were blamed for all the nation's problems, as were the external enemy, communism, which was connected from the Nazi perspective to race. Who are communists? Well, they're Slavs. And, of course, their basic goal was to destroy people they saw as subhuman and take their land and resources, principally food and oil. And so this is, the battleground. This is very different from American-style liberal democracy. Now, we'll talk later in the section on race. The United States is pretty darn racist in this time period. But, I mean, wow. Compared to when we think about in a relative comparison, this stuff is extraordinarily racist. And it was very disturbing to many Americans. I should also point out this is one reason why many American Jewish people are going to really go after Hitler even before the United States is technically at war, right? Because they recognize his attacks on Jewish people. But that's going to lead to kind of a division, right? Because you have some people looking to superheroes as the people who kind of represent American ideals that will crush fascism, while you have other people who look at fascism and say, I see those ideals in American superheroes. So you can see kind of a tension here. Now what happens is fascism is defeated and discredited in World War II. No one today is going to consciously say that they're a fascist. Even if they believe in something like fascist ideas, they're usually going to try and use another label, because basically, the Holocaust and the mass Nazi slaughter of people really makes fascism look bad. And I mean, fascism is bad. Don't get me wrong. It would be bad even without those things, but it's just absolutely discredits, right? The crimes of the Nazis just absolutely discredit this ideology, not to mention, of course, they were utterly defeated. So after World War II, there's basically two different ways of organizing society. You could be communist, or you could be capitalist liberal democracy like the United States. So either follow the Soviet Union, follow the United States, Great Britain, France, one or the other. And so what happens then is after World War II, you have this new Cold War, where you have this kind of struggle between communism and capitalist liberal democracy. Now you may say, well, wait a second, weren't they allies during World War II? And it's like, well, yes, they were allies, but they were unified by their hatred of a common enemy, the Nazis, and to a certain extent Japan, and which it's arguable whether or not Japan was fascist, but it was on the side of the Axis, certainly, was definitely an authoritarian government. But in any case, it was a common enemy that held together the capitalist liberal democracies and the Soviet Union. That's what held the Allies together. So with the disappearance of the Nazis, the very different goals of the communists and the capitalist liberal democracies became apparent. Right? I mean, they were always apparent. But now, if our goal was to beat the Nazis, okay, we check that off the list. What's our next goal? Oh, it's to make sure that our political system is ascendant. It's to make sure that we are the leaders of the world. And this is difficult because and one thing I want to stress, sometimes people want to try and say, communism, capitalist liberal democracy, it's all kind of the same thing. It is not. They have very different understandings of how the world should work. So, for example, both sides agreed that democracy is a good thing. Right? The Soviet Union's technical name was the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Right? The Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The People's Republic of China. Right? They accepted officially democracy, but from an American perspective, democracy means voting in elections where there's a real choice between at least two political parties. In communist countries, democracy meant seeing that the will of the people was done, and who better knows the will of the people than the Communist Party. They also had different understandings of the role of the state and non-state organizations. From the perspective of a capitalist liberal democracy, NGOs are fine. Red Cross is fine. Church groups, religious groups are fine. That's okay. But from a communist perspective, those things need to be kept under control because they're not communist. And there's also just a fundamental issue, and I don't want to oversimplify this too much, but basically, which is more important, economic productivity or equality? Right? Capitalism tends to emphasize economic productivity, whereas communism tends to emphasize equality. So I just want to stress, this is not simply a struggle between two groups of people over power. This is a struggle over worldview. It's an ideological struggle in which each side saw the other as a serious threat to their way of life. Now, one thing I want to stress is also, this is a zero-sum game. Only one side can win. You can't be half communist and half capitalist liberal democracy. Right? Only one side can actually win this thing. So in many ways, the situation is very similar to what was happening before both world wars. You had basically two different blocks of countries who were looking at each other and see each other as a threat. But now it threatens to be more dangerous because now they both have nuclear weapons. So one thing I want to stress, this class is looking primarily from, in this section, from the American perspective. We'd already talked about what was going on in Japan, so we don't have to talk about the Japanese perspective as much. But one thing I should point out, Japan is basically part of the capitalist liberal democratic order after World War II. But like I said, this threatens to be more dangerous. You've got these blocks of countries looking at each other, ready to fight. So there's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of fear that the American and developing Japanese way of life might be destroyed. And to add to that fear, I want to stress, even though you can say that the capitalist liberal democracies won the Cold War, didn't always look that way. Especially not in the 40s and 50s. Right? So to give you an example, these countries all here, before World War II, had been basically capitalist liberal democracies. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria had all basically been capitalist liberal democracies to varying degrees. They at least accepted that view officially, even if they didn't act that way functionally. For example, Poland had dictatorship for a while. But after World War II, because the Soviet Union invaded Germany, made sense, it was at war with Germany, all these countries will be forced to accept communist governments. So communism is expanding in Europe. And in 1949, the Chinese Communist Party won the Civil War and defeated the anti-communist Chinese forces. So a country that had been anti-communist, largest country in the world in terms of population, flips and becomes communist. So there is a lot of fear. And one thing I want to point out, I was born in 1978, and this fear was very real. All right. And I don't remember anyone telling me I should be afraid, but there was just this kind of atmosphere. So I want to stress this anxiety was real, and there was reason for it to be real. You know, there was Cold War paranoia, but just because you're paranoid doesn't mean people aren't out to get you. And many Americans did feel, and I think with some reason, but sometimes, or a lot of times it was overdone, that there was a threat to our way of life and to the worldview which we held and to our very security. So how does that connect to comics? Well, one major issue was the question after World War II of juvenile delinquency. Now, first of all, I want to point out, first of all, there was a fear that there was increasing juvenile delinquency. Now, and then of course, well, what's the cause? If we have an increasing amount of juvenile delinquency, what's the cause? And some people said, well, it's because soldiers were away from home and their kids, you know, they didn't have a dad around to help keep an eye on them. Their mother was, you know, having to be Rosie the Riveter and it was out working. So, you know, of course that's going to lead to increased juvenile delinquency. Some people question whether juvenile delinquency even existed or whether it was really going up or not, right? There's always this problem. Once you start counting crimes, like, you know, for example, if you didn't count crimes committed by juveniles and then all of a sudden you do start counting crimes, of course the number goes way up. And if you get better at recording crimes, it doesn't mean the number went up. It just means you're better at recording them. But in any case, there was a panic. And this appeared in popular culture with movies like I Accuse My Parents, in which you have a good kid who falls into juvenile delinquency, falls into a life of crime. I chose this one in particular because Mystery Science Theater 3000, which is an awesome show, made fun of it. And if you've not seen it, you totally should. But there was this fear of juvenile delinquency. And I want to focus on this for a couple reasons. Remember, it's a lot of times it's children who are reading comics, right? And if you're trying to figure out what is the cause, why is it that we have increasing amount of juvenile delinquency? You're going to say, well, what are kids doing? Well, they're reading comics. So it's important to note that you've got this anxiety, this fear, and there's always, whenever we have this kind of fear, it's exacerbated when it comes to children, right? Everyone's always thinking, what will happen to the children? What will the next generation be like? And from many Americans' perspective, the next generation seems to be getting worse because you have this problem of juvenile delinquency. Well, what's the cause? Right? Well, maybe it's popular culture. Maybe it's what the children are doing. And this kind of runs into something else that's going on in the 1940s and 1950s, is what do we need to solve these external and internal problems? Right? On one side, we're threatened by the Soviet Union, by communism. On the other side, we're threatened by the juvenile delinquency, and there's a lot of other issues too. What do we need? And there was a kind of gender crisis where it was said, well, we need men who are strong, but who aren't overly violent. We need men who are nurturing and strong. If we have strong, responsible men, this would mostly be fathers. Fatherhood would become the ideal, though I think to a lesser extent you have older brothers being the ideal. They can bring order to society. They can discipline society. They can deal with our external and internal problems and save American democracy. Right? Save American democracy. That's the idea. And this image is from a TV show that had originally been a radio show called Father Knows Best. And you can see he's the center, right? There's his loving wife looking adoringly at him, as is his older daughter, and then everyone's taking good care of him. And of course, you know, the people have problems, and the father swoops in and solves their problems with his wise advice. But the key thing is he doesn't yell, he doesn't scream, he doesn't hit anyone. He's responsible. Right? He's a strong, responsible man. And so you've got these problems, and you've got this kind of ideal about gender. And I want to stress this isn't the only thing, but it's something that comes up a lot. You've got this gender ideal that you think men should follow to bring order and discipline to society so we can use our freedoms responsibly to defeat the communists. And one thing I want to stress, you may say, well, this is kind of weird. How do we order and discipline to bring freedom? The paranoia that existed among democracies was, what if people don't use freedom responsibly? You've got systems like fascism and communism where everything's very disciplined. What happens if people don't use their freedoms responsibly, right? Democracy won't be able to survive. So there's always this tension in democracies between trying to allow people freedom, because that's the whole point of democracy, without allowing license and with making sure that we use our freedoms responsibly. And that's where you get, I think, this kind of image. So let's jump then into comics. So let's look at some comic book statistics, because I think today, if you were to have a moral panic, people would not blame comic books because, honestly speaking, not that many people read them, right? So one thing we want to stress, comic books were doing well. Something like half of the United States population read comic books. So this would mean that you have people who aren't kids reading comics. I want to stress that. And I chose this image on purpose. I think this is fascinating, right? You go down to the drugstore and there were your comics. Today, like I'm in Greenwood recording this, I'm not sure where I could go to buy a comic. When I was a kid, I just needed to go to the grocery stores would sell them, as too would drugstores, right? So you could go into Walgreens or CVS and they'd have comics on a rack like this. So to continue, right? So this is how present comics are and how many people read them. Something like if you look at kids, 95% of boys, 91% of girls are reading comics. So very, very popular. 25% of people who graduate high school are reading comics. In 1940, there was something like a 17 million comic monthly circulation. So like 17 million comics were being purchased in 1940. And I want to stress, people traded comics. So this doesn't mean that 17 million people read comics every month. It was a much higher number because each kid would buy a comic and then they would trade them back and forth with their friends. By 1953, this had gone up to 70 million, perhaps 100 million. So comics are huge. And something like $1 billion is being spent on comics each year. That's astounding. So I want to stress, now we maybe think about comics as kind of something that like is a, it's like a subgroup, right? It's not the mainstream, right? It's kind of a specialized group of people who read comics. In this time period, no, that's just something you do. You read comics. And one thing I want to stress, we've been focusing on superheroes in this class. There were other comics, and during this period, they're becoming more diverse. So, for example, in 1939, you had the development of Archie comics, which was this kind of idea of this kind of teen, humorous comics. So you've got Archie, he's kind of being goofy, and you have funny stuff happening, but it's teens who are doing it, so it allowed you to bring in kind of romance and things like that. So, it was something more for middle school and older kids. They could see they also have funny animals there, but I think these funny animals eventually get kicked out. And then after World War II, you have the development of romance comics, which seem to be mostly aimed at women, though, and I don't want to be, what can I say? I don't want to be gross here, but to kind of paraphrase what one author wrote was that in these romance comics, they would have these long conversations between the girls or the young women about the guys in their lives, and they would always be changing clothes. So you could have some kind of semi-nudity this way, and they would say, well, it's aimed at women, right? So there were boys that would read these too. That's my point. But you can see this diversification, which I want to stress happened before the war, but would continue. You had, there was a whole genre called jungle comics, and we'll talk more about why those were an issue later, but you can kind of get an idea here, first of all, was that one reason they were so popular was it allowed for the excuse to have scantily clad women. And I want to stress, these are the days before the internet. There were very strict rules about what could be on TV, so this would be considered, to us, this is not probably a big deal. In the time period, this was a pretty racy image. And you also had funny animal comics, which are the best. I mean, you can't beat Donald Duck, except maybe Uncle Scrooge. Another very important comic that's going to, genre that's going to become very important is crime comics. And you can see I kind of did a joke here. Crime does not pay, because that's typically how it is, right? Crime does not pay. It's this kind of weird effort to make it look like they're anti-crime when in fact there's this kind of celebration of crime. The criminals look pretty cool until the last frame when they get shot or arrested. And like we talked about before with the readers, they can screen out images they don't like, and you can see why these might be disturbing to people. This is, these guys are clearly going to kidnap this little girl. That's kind of disturbing. And this image of this here, I think, kind of speaks for itself in a sense, why some people might find this disturbing, right? There's this implication of violence against women, and we'll talk more about that because that's a big deal in the terms of the development of the comics code. But this gives you some background so you can better read and understand the comics and watch and understand the cartoons that are coming up in this section.